welcome to today's video. If I'm building a tiny house, do I want it on a trailer or on a... Well, if I want to build a tiny house, do I want to build it on a trailer or on a foundation? Let's talk about that. So, building a tiny house on a foundation versus on a trailer. What the best solution may be for you can depend on several things. It can depend on which country or which state you are in. It can also depend on how much you're willing to spend. It can depend on what you're planning to do with your tiny house once you've built it. If you want to travel, if you want to stay put. These are all variables. And for example, in America, it's almost a necessity to build your tiny house on a trailer because, well, there are certain regulations there that aren't here in the Netherlands. That if you're a tiny house on a trailer, it qualifies as an RV. If you have a tiny house on a foundation, it has to follow the building regulations of a normal house. So if you go by that, for America, it could be handier to build your tiny house on a trailer, but it doesn't have to be. So first, let's talk about building your tiny house on a trailer. Okay, so building your tiny house on a trailer. If you've decided, I want to build my tiny house on a trailer, then you have to think about how big do I want my trailer to be. If you want a really large trailer, there are certain advantages. For example, you have a bigger space to work with, but there are also disadvantages, and that is if you go too big on your tiny house, you have to rent a bigger car with a bigger capacity and rent a driver to drive it, because up to a certain trailer you can drive yourself, but if it gets too big or too heavy, you have to have someone with a special driver's license to drive it for you. If you have a smaller tiny house, of course you have less space to work with, but you also have the advantage of being able to drive it around yourself. Then, if you want to build your tiny house on a trailer, it can be more expensive than building it on a foundation, because a trailer can easily cost around 3,000. So if you want to build it on a trailer, it can be more expensive than building it on a tiny house on a foundation. But I'll get to that later when we're talking about the foundation. Also, if you build a tiny house on a trailer, you have to take into account that it can only be a certain weight. Because if you build it on a trailer, the trailer can't be heavier than a certain amount depending on what trailer you choose to use. So you have to take that into account. So you have to puzzle the lightest materials and find the lightest materials to work with in order to build your tiny house as light as possible. But the biggest advantage of building your tiny house on a trailer is that it is movable. So for example, if you have your tiny house on a place, for example, on your parents' land or on the land of someone else, and that person decides to move or decides, no, I don't want you on my land anymore, you can just hook it up to the back of a car and you can drive away. Whereas with a tiny house on a foundation, that would be a more difficult process. Not impossible, but just more difficult. Also, if you put your tiny house on a trailer, you need to be aware of the width and the length. That you can have a maximum width and length, and the maximum height also as well. If you build a tiny house on a foundation, you can go higher than when you build a tiny house on a trailer. Let's talk about tiny house on foundation.
2 hours later.
Now you may say, well, if it's so difficult to build a tiny house on a foundation and so easy to build it on a trailer, why should I build it on a foundation? Let me explain. If you build a tiny house on a foundation, you can be more creative with your space. You can even build your tiny house in a circle instead of in just a square or a rectangle or whatever, because you're freer to move. You're not limited by your trailer. Your trailer is usually a rectangle or a square, and if you're building on a foundation, you don't have that. You can build a circle, you can build a triangle, hell, you can build a pyramid as a tiny house, and it wouldn't matter. So that's one of the biggest advantages, I would say, of building your tiny house on a foundation. Also, here in the Netherlands, it doesn't really matter if you build a tiny house on a foundation or if you build it on a trailer, because the rules and the laws are basically the same for either. So for me personally, I chose to build my tiny house, or I want to build my tiny house, to build it on a foundation because it's also cheaper. Now, depending on the materials you use for a trailer and depending on the materials you use for a foundation I found out to be cheaper. If you build a foundation, you have to be aware. Hey, if you build your tiny house on a foundation, you have to be aware that what type of foundation should I use? Okay, my camera decided to stop. So where were we? I believe we were with foundations. Oh yeah, what type of foundation should I use for my tiny house? There are a lot of different types of foundation. For example, concrete slabs are really popular. To know which type of foundation you should use, you should ask yourself a couple of questions. Where do I want my tiny house? What type of soil do I want to build it on? How heavy do I want my tiny house to be? Does it matter if it's heavier or less heavy? Do I want it to be movable or do I want it to stay put? And how expensive am I willing to let it get? These are all factors that come into play when deciding a foundation for your tiny house. And there are extra costs that come into play when building your tiny house on a foundation and you want it to be movable. Because if you want it to be movable but you also want to build on a foundation, which is perfectly normal, I want to do that myself, you have to take into account the extra cost that it will take to get your little tiny house from place A to place B, because you have to rent a low loader and those can get really expensive, and you also have to use a crane to put your tiny house down on the place you want it to be. So there are some extra costs, but it doesn't really matter for costs if you want a trailer or a foundation. For my type of thing that I want to build, I found that a foundation is cheaper than a trailer, so I decided to build it on a trailer. Not only that, but also I can be more creative with it, so I can have a bit more room inside my tiny house, and the width can be a bit bigger than with a normal tiny house, and that's what I found really attractive to building on a foundation. So, in conclusion, if you want to build a tiny house on a trailer or on a foundation, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. Do I want to travel with my tiny house? How expensive am I willing to let this get? Where do I want to live with my tiny house? Those are all questions that I would ask myself, if I have asked myself, for building a tiny house. And I advise you to do the same if you want to build a tiny house for your own. So, if you want me to go more in depth about certain things, for example the regulations in the Netherlands, so how exactly do those regulations work in the Netherlands, where I come from, I can make a series, or I can go more in depth about that in another series of videos or in another video. So if you want that, please let me know in the comments and maybe I'll make it. For now, please subscribe and click on that little notification bell next to it, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!